In a world of modern Porsches, a new one will arrive on the scene from yesteryear, and it'll change the game forever.
And that Porsche is, of course, this one, the Porsche 996 shape of the 911 series from the early 2000s, 2001 in particular, and many people on the channel over the past few days since the 1.28 update were asking for tunes for this car, review for it, even rivals matches of course, and those are all very obvious things to do because it is a significant returning face, interestingly, to the franchise, but in a roundabout way, because of course it was kind of available in Gran Turismo 3, but not really for most people, and of course the closest thing that we had to it in most Gran Turismo games was the roof models, in particular the Roof RGT, with similar spec, slightly different front end, even though the 3400S, which is of course kind of a Boxster in effect, has the front end of this car. So if you put those two together, you essentially get this machine. Now, we already looked, of course, at the newer Porsche, the 2008 facelift version of the 997 shape, and that one's brilliant. We did an N400 circuit tune for it, we did an N400 cash cow setup for it, we did the review, of course, for it. Brilliant car across the board. I said probably my favourite of this update in terms of just how much it surprised me, how good it turned out to be. This one is a completely different animal because in some ways I would say it's easily the best of the 911s that we have in the game, and in other ways not so much. It's not bad in any particular way, it's just not the strongest. So to cover first of all the things that I think are really good about this car, there are two in particular. One is the price. This is by far the cheapest 911 in the game at 140,000 credits. That is really good because it's expensive enough to allow it to enter into events such as the Blue Moon Bay cash earning event, various others too, and it's also befitting of a car of its type in a game like this, but it's not ridiculously expensive. It's 20 grand cheaper than the newer 911, and a lot cheaper, about 110 grand cheaper than the existing GT3 RS. Now of course, the difference between this one and the other two is much more noticeable than the difference between the 997 and the 991, which isn't too surprising. It is a turn of the century sports car. In its time, you could argue super sports car. Nowadays, not so much. That's why I've put it in Weekend Warriors as a playlist rather than super sports, because it doesn't really perform like one by today's standards. It's more sports car territory, up against stuff like the Mercedes SL500 for instance, or the older SL600, the R129 shape if that were brought back to the game, that kind of thing. Now that's not to say that this is not an impressive car. The other thing that's so great about it, I would say, apart from the price, is the class. And this of course many of you guys do already know about. I even did a tune for this earlier today. You can detune this particular 911, and currently only this 911, down into N300, whereas both of the other two can only go down to N400, which is still excellent and they are very OP at that, but this one just has that extra advantage. And not only does that mean that you can use it in N300 for circuit racing, but it also potentially means that with the right tune and with the right driving style, you could again use it to earn huge amounts of cash in that Blue Moon Bay cash event, which many of you guys, myself included, use as our primary source of income in the game. A lot of people are against that concept. Fine, you know, do what you want. But for those of us who do enjoy it, an N300 car is a very important thing. And the GT40, I would argue, is still one of the best options. This one could potentially rival that. On that subject though, and in more of a roundabout way talking about its handling, that is where things get interesting. That's the not so good point, I would say, about this car, and that is that the handling is not bad. Not at all. In fact, it's one of the very strange occasions where the handling is actually better on sports tyres, such as the ones that I'm using here, than on racing tyres. If you put racing soft tyres on the front and the back, it suddenly handles in a very strange way, almost like it has crab steering, like all-wheel steer, which is weird. On sports softs though, it feels great, and again, with my N300 tune earlier, it performs well. It goes around corners just like you'd want it to, dominant N300 car, potentially. But it's that back end that can sometimes catch you out. Now if you tune it correctly, such as the tune that I did earlier, where you're dealing with less power, it's very heavily modified, heavily tuned, purely for cornering and grip. Essentially, that brings it under control, but when you drive it straight out of the box, or if you try, for instance, winning the aforementioned Blue Moon Bay event with it, you'll find yourself greeted by considerably different handling manners to the 997 or the 991. This is a much slipperier car. It's a good drifter, that's for sure, and as I said again in my initial breakdown of the entire patch last Wednesday, I guess that was, the car feels smoother. It's a softer experience. The visuals, the style, it's not as aggressive, it's not as sharp. Again, earlier 2000s will do that for you. It's got a more smooth sound, a more smooth power delivery, more smooth handling, and although that sounds good across the board, and it would be in real life if you're looking for comfort and drivability, in a game, of course, if you're not as sharp, you're potentially not going to be as quick. And of course, just like as I said with the 997, Porsches and Porsche technology accelerate very quickly. With each new facelift, they get significantly better, and you can feel that for sure with this car. Now, with that being said, as I mentioned earlier on, that does not make this a bad machine, not in the slightest. It's really good, in fact, but I would just caution you as to the kind of events that you enter, the kind of tyres that you plan to use, and of course the type of tuning that you choose to apply to it, because this is one of those 911s where I would actually encourage you to keep it to lower levels of power if you want to get the best results out of it in terms of making it competitive, because in the higher classes it's kind of irrelevant. You might as well just use the newer ones or use something else like a Viper, whatever. This one, it has its niche, it has its slice in the market. And in terms of power, you don't need to drop it that much. It's only got 354 horsepower to begin with, so drop it down to whatever it is, 344 or so, to get it into N300, and you're ready to go. It's very close to what the car originally had, which means it's perfect for it, because that was what the manufacturer intended. Drop that weight, you are ready to go. Apart from that, across the board, it's got a ton of potential, and again, I'm glad that we can detune it to N300, because when you have a car like this, which is, let's be honest, outdated to some degree, just factually speaking, it is older than the other Porsches, it's dated compared to them, technologically speaking. So when you have a car like that, unless you want it to just end up being essentially a collector's piece, you've got to give it something that it's good at, something that's different. And that is definitely the case with this car. That N300 capability, of course, balance of performance notwithstanding, potentially online lobbies, it's all down to that kind of stuff, but when you can use it for that, it is most definitely a weapon. All Porsches have great straight line speed pretty much as standard. It's kind of like a rotary, they do as well. But when you nail the cornering, it's a weapon, for sure. And it's a much more affordable one than some of the other Porsches in the game. So overall, it's a nice stroll down Porsche's memory lane, and it's one which can still compete. But it's one which can still compete when used correctly. So I definitely recommend checking out the car. It makes a nice change as well from the newer Porsches in the game, but it's not so old that it feels irrelevant. That's cool. It's kind of a middle ground between the two. But that's it for this pick overall. If you haven't already, then I would recommend checking out my circuit tune for this car. And of course, that's it for this breakdown. So I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.